Imagine you paid $60 for a game. You spent 200 hours in it. You built friendships in it. You made memories in it. And then one day, you log in and get a message that says the servers are shutting down in 30 days. A publisher decided it was more profitable to kill it than to keep it alive. And the part that really stings is that they do not have to give you a refund. They do not have to release the code. They do not have to do anything. They just turn off the lights. And you are left holding a disk or a download license for software that no longer works. This has happened to hundreds of games. The list grows every single year. For a long time, gamers complained, made Reddit posts, maybe left a review, and then moved on. Because there was nothing to do. That was the answer. Until a guy named Ross Scott decided that was not good enough. Ross Scott is the creator behind the long-running machinima series Freeman's Mind. He has been making content since the early YouTube era. He is a guy who loves games and got genuinely deeply angry at watching companies sell products they intended to destroy. In July of 2021, he published what became a foundational video essay called Games as a Service is Fraud. The argument was simple and devastating. If you sell someone a video game and you build into that product a kill switch that renders it permanently non-functional, and you never disclose that to the consumer at the point of sale, that is fraud. That is taking money for something you know will eventually be worth nothing without telling the buyer. The video got millions of views. But more importantly, it sparked something. Because Ross did not just want to complain, he wanted to do something. So he launched the Stop Killing Games initiative. The premise was equally clear. He wanted governments to pass legislation requiring publishers to either maintain games in a playable state or release them into a functional condition when support ends. No more games dying and taking your purchase with them. Either keep it alive, hand over the tools, or face legal consequences. The Stop Killing Games petition in the European Union crossed 1 million signatures. 1 million? That is the legal threshold required under a European Citizens Initiative to trigger a formal institutional response from the European Commission. That is not a Reddit upvote count or a change.org campaign. It is a binding procedural milestone written into EU law. When a citizens' initiative clears 1 million signatures across at least 7 member states, the Commission is legally required to examine it, convene a public hearing where the organizers can present their case directly to Commission representatives, and then issue a formal written response explaining whether it will pursue legislation and why. The Commission cannot simply ignore it. That public hearing is now on the table. And then the United Kingdom's Parliament took up a debate on the issue. Actual elected representatives stood in the House of Commons and discussed whether publishers should be allowed to sell games and then remotely destroy them. A question was raised directly to the relevant minister. That exchange is in the official parliamentary record. It happened. Now pause here, because you need to understand what this feels like from inside the gaming industry. For decades, publishers have operated under a very comfortable assumption. Gamers complain loudly online and do nothing in the real world. That was the playbook. You could ship broken games, sell unfinished products, delete features post-launch, and shut down servers while keeping the purchase price. And the consequence was some bad press and a few thousand negative reviews that eventually got buried. The system worked perfectly for them. Ross Scott just broke the system. The legal and lobbying machinery of the game publishing industry did not take this lying down. The Entertainment Software Association, the primary lobbying body for major publishers in the United States, began quietly engaging with policymakers in Europe well before the petition crossed its threshold. Trade associations representing companies like Ubisoft, EA, and Activision Blizzard started circulating arguments against the initiative to sympathetic ears in Brussels and Westminster. The core argument from the industry was predictably constructed to sound reasonable while being fundamentally misleading. They claimed that requiring live service game preservation would be technically impossible, financially ruinous for the industry, and would somehow disproportionately harm small developers. Every single one of those arguments collapses under scrutiny. Technically impossible? Games like Rogue Company, Knockout City, and Battle Right have all had server code released or community servers enabled after shutdown. Those are not hypothetical examples. Those are documented cases where publishers chose preservation, Approving the infrastructure decision is a business choice, not a technical wall. Financially ruinous? These are companies generating hundreds of millions to billions in annual revenue. The cost of open sourcing a server binary or releasing emulator documentation is not going to bankrupt Ubisoft, a company that spent over $10 billion in acquisitions across a single decade. And the harm to small developers argument is perhaps the most cynical framing of all, because the initiative has always been structured around commercially sold products from companies with the means to act. An indie developer shipping a single-player game with no kill switch is not the target. Activision is. EA is. Everyone in the room at the ESA knows this, and they are making the small developer argument anyway because it polls well with people who are not paying close attention. The fact that the industry mobilized this level of coordinated institutional response tells you something important. Organizations do not spend money fighting movements they believe will dissolve on their own. When you see trade group briefings, Brussels engagement, and carefully worded public statements about technical feasibility all arriving at roughly the same time, that is an industry that has looked at a threat and decided it requires a serious counter-campaign. So, what has actually resulted from crossing that 1 million signature threshold? The formal European Citizens Initiative process now requires the Commission to schedule and hold a public hearing. At that hearing, the Stop Killing Games organizers present their case directly to Commission officials, on record, in a structured institutional setting. Following the hearing, the Commission must publish a formal response that either commits to considering legislation or explains in writing why it will not pursue the matter. Neither outcome is nothing. Legislation means law. A refusal means a documented public record that can anchor future campaigns, inform national-level legislation in individual member states, and serve as a reference point for every consumer rights organization in Europe that picks up this fight afterward. Ross Scott has stated clearly that he views this as a long campaign, and he intends to use every stage of the process. In the United Kingdom, the parliamentary debate generated sufficient attention that consumer advocacy organizations began formally aligning with the movement. The conversation has moved out of gaming forums and into institutions that have actual influence over policy. In the United States, the movement has not yet reached the same legislative momentum, but the cultural conversation has shifted in a measurable way. When Ubisoft shut down The Crew in April of 2024, the backlash was different in kind from anything that came before it. It was organized. It cited specific legal frameworks. Players were not just expressing anger, they were articulating why the shutdown constituted a consumer rights violation and what the structural remedy should look like. That level of public literacy about the issue is a direct product of 3 years of educational work by Stop Killing Games. Several state attorneys general's offices in the U.S. have open consumer protection proceedings related to digital goods. And while none are directly tied to game preservation yet, the legal architecture for challenging these practices at the national level is being built piece by piece. The games you're playing right now, if they are live service titles, exist at the pleasure of a publisher. Destiny 2 has had content vaulted and deleted that players paid real money to access. Fortnite could end tomorrow, and Epic would owe you nothing for every skin, battle pass, and V-Buck purchase you ever made. Apex Legends, Warzone, Rainbow Six Siege, Valorant, every one of these titles can legally disappear overnight and take every dollar you spent on them into the void. That is not a hypothetical. That is the current legal default condition of the industry you are actively participating in and funding. And it is going to get worse before it gets better, because the industry is accelerating toward live service, not retreating from it. More games are being designed from the ground up with the explicit understanding that they will eventually be sunsetted. The revenue model depends on urgency, scarcity, and the psychological pressure of impermanence. Create a battle pass with a 30-day timer. Drive microtransaction spending, extract maximum revenue, then shut it down before maintenance costs exceed returns, and start the cycle again with a new title. You are not a customer in this model in any traditional sense. You are a recurring extraction target. And the only structural check on that model advancing unchallenged is a movement that just hit a binding legislative threshold in the European Union and sparked official debate in the British Parliament. So, what can you do right now? The first thing you can do is engage with the petition infrastructure directly. The Stop Killing Games website has country-specific guidance on how the initiative works in different regions and how to verify your signature is properly recorded. If you are in the United States, there are representative contact tools on the site that streamline the process of reaching your elected officials with a pre-structured message about digital consumer rights. The second thing you can do is research publisher shutdown histories before you spend money. Ubisoft has terminated The Crew, shut down multiple online titles, and vaulted paid content from active games. That is a documented pattern, not an isolated incident. Use that information as a purchasing filter. Reward publishers who have demonstrated preservation commitments and apply financial pressure to those who have not. The third thing you can do is participate where it counts institutionally. The Stop Killing Games subreddit, the official Discord, and the campaign's social channels are coordinating outreach timed to specific legislative windows. When a parliamentary debate is scheduled, constituent letters matter on the record. When a regulatory comment period opens, individual submissions get counted. These are not symbolic gestures. They are documented inputs into processes that produce actual outcomes. The fourth thing you can do is support the journalists and independent creators keeping this story visible between milestones. Outlets and individual creators who have covered this campaign substantively are doing the work of sustaining public pressure during the slow institutional phases. Sharing that coverage and financially supporting it keeps the story alive in the news cycle long enough to matter. The fifth thing you can do is make end-of-life planning a public conversation before launch, not an afterthought after shutdown. When a new live service game is announced, ask loudly and in public, what is your preservation plan when this game ends? Some publishers have begun answering that question preemptively because organized communities have started demanding it. Rogue Company released server tools. Knockout City enabled community servers. Battlerite went free to play before its shutdown to extend the community's window. These outcomes were not charity. They were concessions extracted by sustained, organized player pressure. More pressure produces more concessions. That is not optimism. That is a demonstrated pattern. This story is ultimately about something that extends well beyond video games and into the future of how digital ownership works for all of us. For the better part of 2 decades, digital goods have existed in a legal gray zone where the consumer protections that apply to physical products simply do not apply. You bought a game, but legally you licensed it under revocable terms. You spent hundreds of dollars building a library across a digital storefront, and legally, the company can alter or remove access to that library for almost any reason. This has been the default condition across gaming, music, streaming, software, and ebooks. It has been accepted partly because the legal language was buried in terms nobody reads, partly because fighting it felt structurally impossible, and partly because each individual loss felt too small to justify the effort of a legal challenge. Stop Killing Games is the first organized, cross-national, legally structured campaign to challenge this default at the level of binding legislation. And it worked well enough to cross a formal threshold in the European Union and reach the floor of the British Parliament. If European law eventually requires publishers to preserve or release games at the end of life, that precedent does not stay in gaming. It bleeds into every other category of digital goods: streaming rights, software licensing, the entire architecture of what it means to own something you bought online. The publishers who are nervous right now are not just nervous about games. They are nervous about what a win here signals for the broader digital ownership conversation. And they are right to be paying attention. You have been paying for things that were designed to disappear. For the first time in a very long time, there is a real, documented, procedurally active path to changing that. If this story matters to you, share the video. Drop a comment with what game you lost that you still think about. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because the next chapter of this story moves through official institutional processes that are going to produce concrete outcomes. And I am going to be here covering every development as it happens.